You ate my chocolate, didn't you, you little thief? Victoria's manicured finger pointed accusingly at Emma's pale face. The kitchen was locked, the pantry sealed, even the fruit bowl removed from the dining table. 3 days had passed since Emma's last meal, a punishment for allegedly stealing a single piece of candy she never touched. Now, in the grand library where her father once read her stories, Emma was about to do something that would expose the monster living in their mansion. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and how this story makes you feel so far. The Blackwood mansion stood like a monument to wealth on the hills of Beverly Hills, its pristine white columns catching the morning sunlight. Inside, however, darkness had settled like a thick fog ever since Emma's father, Robert Blackwood, had died in a car accident 6 months ago. What was once filled with laughter and the scent of fresh cookies now echoed with harsh voices and the sharp click of designer heels against marble floors. Emma sat in her father's leather chair in the grand library, surrounded by thousands of books that once brought her comfort. Now, at 7 years old, she felt smaller than ever among the towering shelves. Her long blonde hair, once carefully braided by her father each morning, hung limp and unwashed around her shoulders. Her pink dress, the same one she'd worn for 3 days, was wrinkled and stained with tears she'd tried to hide. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 10 times. Professor James Wellington would arrive for her tutoring session in an hour. Emma's stomach cramped painfully, reminding her of the emptiness that had become her constant companion. She pressed her hand against her belly, trying to quiet the rumbling sounds that seemed to echo through the silent house. Victoria Blackwood, though Emma refused to think of her as a mother figure, had made her position crystal clear 3 days ago. Standing in her designer red dress, her dark hair perfectly styled, she had transformed from the grieving widow the world saw into something far more sinister. Until you admit, you stole my imported Swiss chocolate, Victoria had hissed, her voice dropping to a whisper that sent chills down Emma's spine. You won't see another morsel of food. Thieves don't deserve to eat. But Emma hadn't stolen anything. She remembered exactly what had happened. She'd been reading in the library when Victoria's sister, Aunt Margaret, had visited. Emma had heard them talking about the chocolate, how Victoria had eaten it herself while on a phone call but had forgotten. She'd even laughed about it, saying she'd blame it on the little pest if Robert asked about it. But when Victoria realized Emma might have overheard, the story changed. Now Emma faced the consequences of knowledge she wished she'd never gained. The hunger had evolved through stages. The first day brought sharp pangs and dizziness. The second day brought weakness and a strange floating sensation. By the third day, Emma's body had begun consuming itself, and she'd started looking at things differently. The leather binding of books began to look less like decoration and more like ... possibility. Emma's hands trembled as she opened her mathematics textbook Advanced Arithmetic for Young Minds. The pages were cream-colored, thick stock paper with a slight vanilla scent from the binding glue. She'd noticed yesterday how the paper felt softer than regular notebook paper, almost edible. Maybe just a tiny piece, she whispered to herself, glancing toward the door. Victoria was having her nails done in the salon upstairs, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, had been dismissed for the week, another of Victoria's cost-cutting measures that conveniently removed any witnesses to Emma's suffering. Emma carefully tore a small corner from page 47, the section about fractions. Her father had always said she was good with fractions. Half of something is better than all of nothing, he used to joke. Now the words took on a darker meaning. The paper felt strange on her tongue, dry and slightly bitter from the ink. She chewed it slowly, trying to pretend it was one of Mrs. Chen's rice crackers. The texture was wrong, and it absorbed all the moisture in her mouth. But her stomach cramped with such desperate hunger that even this seemed like relief. She tore another piece, this time from the word problems section. If Tommy has 5 apples and gives away 3... Emma stopped reading and just focused on chewing. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was eating math problems about food while starving. The grandfather clock seemed to tick louder in the silence. Emma had always loved this library. Her father had built it specifically for her, filling it with every children's book he could find. plus educational materials for her advancing studies. The rolling ladder, the cozy reading nooks, the way afternoon sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, it had been her sanctuary. Now, it felt like a prison where she'd been reduced to eating her own schoolwork to survive. Emma was reaching for another page when she heard the soft sound of expensive Italian leather shoes approaching down the marble hallway. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she quickly closed the textbook and wiped the paper fragments from her mouth. She smoothed her wrinkled dress and tried to look like she'd been studying normally. The footsteps paused outside the library door. Professor James Wellington stood 6'2" with distinguished grey hair and kind blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. At 55, he'd spent his career educating the children of America's wealthiest families. But he'd never encountered a case quite like Emma Blackwood. When Robert had hired him 6 months before his death, James had been struck by the man's genuine love for his daughter and his commitment to giving her the best education money could buy. Robert had paid James handsomely, $200 per hour, 3 times his usual rate, not just for Emma's academic instruction, but to be a stable, caring presence in her life. She's gifted, Robert had explained during their first meeting, but more than that, she's kind. In a world that might try to harden her because of our wealth, I want someone who'll nurture her compassion. Now, standing outside the library door that stood slightly ajar, James noticed something that made his blood run cold. Through the crack, he could see Emma sitting at the massive oak desk, but she wasn't working on mathematics or literature. She was carefully tearing pages from her textbook and placing them in her mouth, chewing with the desperate concentration of someone who hadn't eaten in days. James had seen enough poverty in his early years teaching in public schools to recognize starvation when he saw it. The hollow cheeks, the way Emma's clothes hung loose on her shrinking frame, the careful, deliberate way she consumed the paper as if it were a precious meal. These were signs he'd hoped never to see in a mansion worth $20 million. He stepped back from the door, his mind racing. In his briefcase, he carried the same materials he brought every week: advanced reading comprehension worksheets, geometry problems designed for children twice Emma's age, and today's special edition, a container of homemade cookies his wife had baked. He'd brought them thinking Emma might enjoy a treat during their break. Now he realized those cookies might be the first food she'd had in days. James took a deep breath and knocked gently on the doorframe. "Emma, may I come in?" Inside, Emma's eyes went wide with panic. She quickly swallowed the paper she'd been chewing and brushed any remaining fragments from her desk. "Yes, Professor Wellington," she called out, trying to make her voice sound normal, despite its raspy weakness. James entered the library with his usual warm smile, though his heart was breaking at what he'd witnessed. Emma sat rigidly in her chair, hands folded, trying to project the image of a well-cared-for student. But James could see everything. The paper fragments stuck to her lower lip, the guilty flush in her pale cheeks, the way her eyes darted nervously between his face and the textbook she'd been consuming. "Good morning, Emma," James said gently, setting his briefcase on the desk. "How are you feeling today?" "Fine, Professor Wellington," Emma replied automatically, though her voice was barely above a whisper. James noticed her mathematics textbook was open to a page with a conspicuous tear along the margin. Several other pages showed similar damage, and there were tiny pieces of paper scattered around her workspace like evidence of a desperate meal. "I brought something special today," James said, opening his briefcase and pulling out the container of cookies. Emma's eyes locked onto it with an intensity that confirmed his worst fears. "My wife made chocolate chip cookies. Would you like some?" Emma's composure cracked for just a moment. Her hand reached halfway toward the container before she caught herself and pulled it back. I'm not supposed to, ... She whispered, then stopped, as if saying more would get her in trouble. James sat down across from her, keeping his voice calm and reassuring. "Not supposed to what, sweetheart?" Emma's lower lip trembled. She looked toward the library door, then back at the cookies, then at James's kind face. The war between hunger and fear played out across her delicate features. She said, "I can't eat until ... Emma's voice broke. "Until I admit I took something I didn't take." The pieces clicked into place for James. He'd noticed changes in Emma over the past few weeks. Her increasing lethargy during lessons, the way she'd become distracted and unfocused. How her clothes seemed to grow looser each time he saw her. He'd attributed it to grief over her father's death, but now he understood it was something far more sinister. "Emma," James said softly, "when was the last time you had a real meal?" Emma looked down at her hands. "Monday morning," she whispered, "before the chocolate went missing. Today was Thursday." James felt anger burning in his chest, not at Emma, but at the woman who could starve a 7-year-old child over a piece of candy. But he kept his voice gentle. "Would you like to tell me what really happened with the chocolate?" Emma's story came out in halting whispers. She told James about overhearing Victoria and Aunt Margaret, about Victoria eating the chocolate herself and joking about blaming Emma, about how the story had changed when Victoria realized Emma had been listening. "She locked everything up," Emma explained, her voice growing smaller. "The kitchen, the pantry, even the fruit bowl. She said thieves don't deserve to eat." Emma touched her textbook with trembling fingers. "I got so hungry that I thought, ... maybe paper might help. Like when people eat grass when there's no food." James felt his heart shatter. This brilliant, kind child had been reduced to eating her schoolwork to survive, all because a cruel woman wanted to maintain her lie. He made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "Emma," James said firmly, "you are not a thief, and no child should ever have to eat paper because they're hungry." He opened the cookie container and held it out to her. "These cookies are yours. Eat as many as you want." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "But Victoria said." "Victoria is wrong," James interrupted, "and what she's doing to you is not just wrong, it's illegal. It's called child abuse, and I'm going to make sure it stops today." Emma reached for a cookie with shaking hands, then hesitated. What if she finds out? What if she gets angrier? James pulled out his phone. "She won't get the chance to get angrier. I'm calling someone who can help protect you." As Emma bit into her first real food in 3 days, tears streaming down her face at the sweet taste of chocolate chips, James dialed a number he'd hoped never to use. Child Protective Services. While he waited for someone to answer, James watched Emma devour the cookies with the desperation of someone who'd forgotten what food tasted like. She ate them so quickly, he worried she might make herself sick, but he didn't have the heart to tell her to slow down. "This is Professor James Wellington," he said when the call connected. "I need to report a case of severe child neglect and abuse. I'm currently with a 7-year-old girl who's been deliberately starved for 3 days. Yes, I'll hold while you transfer me to an investigator." Emma looked up from her third cookie, crumbs on her face and hope flickering in her eyes for the first time in days. "Are you really going to help me?" James reached across the desk and gently brushed the crumbs from her cheek. "Emma, I promise you, you will never be hungry again. Not while I'm here to protect you." The library fell silent except for the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock and the sound of Emma eating her first meal in days. Outside, birds sang in the mansion's perfectly manicured gardens, unaware that inside, a little girl's life was about to be transformed by the kindness of one person who refused to look away from injustice. But Victoria Blackwood was not a woman who gave up easily. And when she discovered what Professor Wellington had done, Emma's nightmare was far from over. The soft chime of Victoria's phone echoed from upstairs as she finished her manicure appointment. The nail technician packed up her supplies and left through the service entrance, leaving Victoria alone to admire her perfectly shaped crimson nails. She was due to meet her friend Cassandra for lunch at the country club, where they would discuss the upcoming charity gala, an event that would showcase Victoria as the grieving widow who'd single-handedly raised her late husband's difficult daughter. Victoria slipped on her diamond tennis bracelet and checked her reflection in the vanity mirror. At 32, she maintained the polished beauty that had first attracted Robert Blackwood at a charity auction 5 years ago. She'd been working as an event coordinator then, struggling to pay her bills while surrounded by the wealth she desperately craved. Robert had been recently divorced, lonely, and impressed by her seemingly genuine interest in his daughter. The marriage had been everything Victoria had hoped for: luxury, status, and access to Robert's considerable fortune. The only inconvenience had been Emma, but Victoria had played the role of loving stepmother perfectly whenever Robert was around. She'd even convinced herself that once Robert was gone, the child would be easier to control. She'd underestimated Emma's spirit. Victoria descended the curved staircase, her heels clicking against the marble with practiced precision. She'd planned to check on Emma before leaving for lunch, not out of concern, but to see if 3 days without food had finally broken the child's stubborn refusal to confess to the chocolate theft. The confession itself wasn't important. Victoria knew perfectly well that she'd eaten the chocolate during a phone call with her lawyer about Robert's will. But Emma had been in the library, close enough to potentially overhear conversations that should remain private. The chocolate incident provided a convenient excuse to assert her authority and remind Emma of her place in the new hierarchy. As Victoria approached the library, she heard voices, Emma's soft whisper and a man's deeper tones. Professor Wellington's weekly session. Victoria had forgotten about the tutor in her focus on Emma's punishment. She paused outside the door, listening to fragments of conversation that made her blood run cold. Haven, 2 eaten in 3 days. Professor Wellington's voice carried a note of concern that Victoria didn't like. She locked everything up. Emma's voice, weak and tearful. This is illegal. Child abuse. Victoria's perfectly manicured hand gripped the doorframe. The tutoring session was supposed to be academic mathematics, literature, perhaps some geography. Not an interrogation about household discipline methods. She pushed open the door with a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. Professor Wellington, how lovely to see you. I hope Emma is being a good student today. James looked up from where he'd been kneeling beside Emma's chair, his phone still in his hand. Emma had frozen mid-bite, a cookie halfway to her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. Mrs. Blackwood, James said, his voice carefully controlled. We need to talk. Victoria's gaze fell on the open container of cookies, the crumbs on Emma's face, and the torn mathematics textbook. She processed the scene quickly. Emma had been caught eating during her punishment, and somehow the tutor had become involved. Of course, Victoria said smoothly, stepping into the library and closing the door behind her. Emma, sweetheart, why don't you go upstairs and wash your face? You've got crumbs all over. Emma looked between Victoria and Professor Wellington, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. Actually, James said firmly, Emma should stay right here. We're having a very important conversation about her welfare. Victoria's smile became sharp-edged. Professor Wellington, I appreciate your concern for Emma's education, but matters of household discipline are really family business. Perhaps we should reschedule today's lesson. Household discipline. James's voice rose slightly. Is that what you call starving a 7-year-old child for 3 days? Making her so desperate for food that she's eating paper from her textbooks? The mask slipped from Victoria's face for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. Then she composed herself, switching to a different strategy. Oh dear, Victoria said, pressing a hand to her heart in mock distress. Has Emma been telling stories again? Professor Wellington, I'm afraid the poor child has been having difficulties with fantasy and reality. Since her father's death, it's quite concerning, actually. Just this morning, I caught her making up elaborate tales about being locked away from food. It's clearly a cry for attention. Emma's face went white. She looked at James with desperate eyes, silently pleading for him to believe her truth over Victoria's lies. James had encountered manipulative parents before, but rarely with such polished skill. Victoria's performance was nearly flawless, the concerned stepmother dealing with a troubled child's psychological issues. If he hadn't witnessed Emma eating paper with his own eyes, he might have been swayed. Mrs. Blackwood, James said carefully, I saw Emma consuming pages from her textbook when I arrived. That's not fantasy. That's the desperate action of a starving child. Victoria's laugh was like breaking glass. Children do such strange things when they want attention, don't they? Emma knows perfectly well where the kitchen is. She's had access to food all along. Then why? James asked. Does she look like she's lost 10 pounds since I saw her last week? Why are there dark circles under her eyes? Why did she tell me she hasn't eaten since Monday? Victoria moved closer to Emma's chair, and James noticed how the child seemed to shrink away from her stepmother's presence. Emma has been a bit under the weather, Victoria said, placing a hand on Emma's shoulder that looked gentle but made the little girl wince. Loss of appetite is common in children processing grief. I've been trying to encourage her to eat, but she's been quite stubborn about it. The gaslighting was masterful, James realized. Victoria was rewriting reality in real time, turning Emma's starvation into a self-inflicted eating disorder, transforming herself from abuser into concerned caregiver. But James had one advantage Victoria didn't know about. He'd already made the call to Child Protective Services. Mrs. Blackwood, James said, I think it would be best if Emma came home with me today while we sort this out. My wife is a pediatric nurse, and she could evaluate Emma's condition properly. Victoria's grip tightened on Emma's shoulder. That won't be necessary. Emma belongs here, in her father's house, with her family. Family, James repeated slowly, doesn't starve children over missing chocolate. The accusation hung in the air like a blade. Victoria's composure cracked slightly, revealing the anger beneath her polished exterior. You're overstepping your bounds, Professor Wellington, Victoria said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You're here to teach mathematics and literature, not to interfere in family matters. Perhaps it's time we found Emma a different tutor. Emma made a small, desperate sound, half gasp, half sob. Professor Wellington was the only adult who'd shown her kindness since her father's death. The thought of losing him too was almost unbearable. That won't be necessary, James said calmly. Because Emma won't be staying in this house much longer. Victoria's eyes narrowed. What exactly do you mean by that? James checked his phone, where a text message waited, CPS investigator, en route. État, 20 minutes. Sarah Chun, supervisor. I mean, James said, that I've contacted Child Protective Services. They're sending an investigator to assess Emma's living situation. Based on what I've witnessed today, I don't think they'll be impressed with your methods of household discipline. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock. Emma looked between the two adults who were deciding her fate, hardly daring to breathe. Victoria's face cycled through expressions, shock, rage, calculation, and finally, cold determination. You've made a serious mistake, Professor Wellington. Victoria said softly. Emma is a troubled child who tells lies to get attention. She's been eating regularly, and I can prove it. In fact, I think you'll find that any evidence to the contrary has been ... misunderstood. Victoria walked to the library's antique phone and dialed a number from memory. Margaret, it's Victoria. I need you to come over immediately. Yes, now. Professor Wellington seems to be having some kind of breakdown, making wild accusations about Emma's care. I think we may need to file a complaint about his inappropriate behavior with a vulnerable child. James realized he was watching a master manipulator at work. Victoria was already constructing an alternative narrative where he was the problem. An unstable tutor who'd overstepped boundaries and filled a grieving child's head with fantasies. But as Victoria spoke to her sister, James noticed something she'd overlooked. Emma's mathematics textbook still lay open on the desk, pages torn and missing, with telltale bite marks along the edges. More importantly, there were tiny pieces of chewed paper scattered around Emma's chair, physical evidence that couldn't be explained away. James quickly took photos with his phone before Victoria could notice, capturing the torn textbook, the paper fragments, and Emma's gaunt appearance. He also recorded a brief video of Victoria's threatening phone call. Her words about misunderstood evidence potentially proving intent to obstruct the investigation. Emma watched Professor Wellington document her suffering, hope and terror warring in her young heart. She understood that this was the moment her life would either change forever or become infinitely worse. Victoria's grip on her shoulder tightened with each photo James took. A silent reminder of the power dynamic that had trapped Emma in this nightmare. The grandfather clock chimed 11:30. In 20 minutes, a CPS investigator would arrive at the Blackwood mansion. Victoria had 20 minutes to construct a defense, destroy evidence, and reshape reality to her advantage. Emma had 20 minutes to find the courage to speak her truth when it mattered most. And James Wellington had 20 minutes to protect a little girl who'd been eating paper to survive in one of Beverly Hills' most beautiful homes. The battle for Emma's future was about to begin in earnest. Victoria ended her call and turned back to face James and Emma, her smile bright and predatory. Margaret will be here shortly to help clear up any misunderstandings. She's witnessed Emma's creative storytelling before. I'm sure she'll be able to provide some much-needed perspective on the situation. Emma's heart sank. Aunt Margaret was Victoria's older sister, cut from the same cloth but with 30 additional years of experience in manipulation. Margaret had been present for some of Emma's worst moments over the past 6 months, not just witnessing Victoria's cruelty but actively participating in it. James sensed Emma's despair and moved his chair closer to hers. "Emma," he said quietly, "remember what we talked about. The truth is powerful, even when it's hard to tell." Victoria overheard and laughed. "The truth. Professor Wellington, you're about to learn an important lesson about truth. It's not what actually happened, it's what can be proven to have happened. And I think you'll find that Emma has been very well cared for in this house." As if summoned by her words, the sound of a car door slamming echoed from the circular driveway. Through the library's stained glass windows, James could see a black sedan that belonged to neither CPS nor Margaret. Victoria looked confused for a moment. Then her face brightened with sudden realization. "Oh, I forgot. Detective Morrison said he might stop by today. Something about finalizing Robert's accident report." James felt his blood chill. Detective Morrison had been the lead investigator on Robert Blackwood's car accident, which had been ruled accidental despite some suspicious circumstances. If Victoria had connections within the police department, she could potentially undermine the CPS investigation before it even began. Heavy footsteps approached the library, and Detective Morrison appeared in the doorway. He was a large man in his 50s with the weathered face of someone who'd seen too much of humanity's darker side. His eyes swept the room, taking in the torn textbook, the cookie container, Emma's hollow-cheeked appearance, and the obvious tension between the adults. "Mrs. Blackwood," Detective Morrison said slowly, "I apologize for interrupting. I just needed your signature on some final paperwork regarding your husband's case." Victoria moved smoothly to greet him, her demeanor shifting into that of the grateful widow. "Of course, Detective Morrison. Though I'm afraid we're having a bit of a situation here. Professor Wellington seems to have some concerns about Emma's well-being that I think might interest you from a professional standpoint." James realized he was about to be painted as either delusional or predatory. Victoria was masterfully manipulating the situation, bringing in a police officer who would naturally be skeptical of wild accusations from a private tutor. "Detective Morrison," James said carefully, "I've called Child Protective Services because I have serious concerns about Emma's treatment in this home. She hasn't eaten in 3 days, and I found her consuming pages from her textbook due to hunger." Detective Morrison's eyebrows rose. He looked at Emma, really looked at her for the first time, and James saw something shift in his expression. Whatever else Morrison might be, he was a father himself, and the sight of Emma's condition was hard to dismiss. "That's quite an accusation," Detective Morrison said slowly. "Emma, is that true? Have you been eating paper?" Emma looked at Victoria, who gave her the slightest shake of her head, a warning disguised as concern. Emma's voice came out as barely a whisper. I. "She's been having some difficulties since her father's death," Victoria interjected smoothly. "Attention-seeking behaviors, making up stories. Her pediatrician says it's quite normal for children processing grief." "What's the pediatrician's name?" Detective Morrison asked. Victoria hesitated for just a fraction of a second, long enough for James to realize she was improvising. "Dr. Harrison, Dr. Michael Harrison. He's been seeing Emma regularly." James pulled out his phone, That's interesting, because Emma told me she hasn't seen any doctor since her father died. Emma, when was your last doctor's visit? Emma looked desperately between the adults, paralyzed by conflicting pressures. Victoria's hand rested on her shoulder like a threat, while Professor Wellington and Detective Morrison waited for her answer. The grandfather clock ticked loudly in the silence. Finally, Emma whispered, "I haven't been to a doctor since Daddy died." Victoria's composure cracked slightly. "Emma, sweetheart, you're confused. Don't you remember Dr. Harrison's visit last month?" "There was no doctor," Emma said, her voice growing slightly stronger. "And I haven't eaten since Monday because you locked the kitchen and said thieves don't deserve food." Detective Morrison's expression hardened. In his 25 years of police work, he'd developed a keen sense for truth versus manipulation. Emma's weak but consistent story rang with authenticity, while Victoria's responses felt increasingly rehearsed. "Mrs. Blackwood," Detective Morrison said, "would you mind showing me this locked kitchen?" Victoria's smile became strained. "Of course, but I should mention that Emma has a history of—" "Just the kitchen, please," Detective Morrison interrupted. As they left the library, James knelt beside Emma's chair. "You did so well, sweetheart. You told the truth, even though it was scary." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "What if they don't believe me? What if I have to stay here?" "Look at me," James said firmly. "I promise you, Emma, you will never have to face this alone again. I won't let anyone hurt you." Through the library windows, James could see another car pulling into the driveway. A white sedan with government plates. The CPS investigator had arrived. Emma saw it too, and for the first time in days, something like hope flickered in her eyes. In the kitchen, Detective Morrison was conducting his own investigation. The locked cabinet doors, the sealed pantry, the absence of any accessible food, all of it painted a clear picture that contradicted Victoria's story of a well-fed child with attention-seeking behaviors. Victoria watched nervously as Morrison documented everything with his phone. "Detective, surely you can see that this is just a misunderstanding. Emma has access to food. She just chooses not to eat when she's upset." Morrison opened the refrigerator, which was fully stocked with expensive delicacies. Caviar, imported cheeses, organic vegetables. But every single item was behind a separate locked compartment, requiring a key that only Victoria possessed. "Mrs. Blackwood," Detective Morrison said quietly, "in my experience, children don't lock themselves away from food. And they certainly don't eat textbook pages unless they're desperate." The doorbell rang, echoing through the mansion's marble halls. Victoria's face went pale as she realized her carefully constructed narrative was about to face professional scrutiny. Sarah Chen from Child Protective Services stood on the doorstep with a briefcase and a grim expression. She'd received James Wellington's call, along with his preliminary evidence photos, and what she'd seen had prompted her to fast-track this investigation. As Victoria reluctantly opened the front door, Emma sat in the library with Professor Wellington, eating her fourth cookie and feeling food in her stomach for the first time in 3 days. The taste of paper was finally fading from her mouth, replaced by chocolate chips and hope. "Professor Wellington," Emma whispered, "what happens now?" James looked down at this brave little girl who'd endured so much and found his voice thick with emotion. "Now, Emma, we make sure you're safe. We make sure you're loved. And we make sure nothing like this ever happens to you again." The grandfather clock chimed noon, marking the end of Emma's 3 days of hunger and the beginning of her fight for a future where kindness would triumph over cruelty. But Victoria Blackwood wasn't finished yet. Sarah Chen entered the Blackwood mansion with the practiced eye of someone who'd investigated hundreds of child welfare cases. At 45, she'd seen wealth used to hide terrible secrets. And she'd learned not to be intimidated by marble floors and crystal chandeliers. "Mrs. Blackwood, I'm Sarah Chen from Child Protective Services," she said, showing her credentials. "We received a report concerning Emma's welfare that requires immediate investigation." Victoria's smile was perfect, but Sarah noticed the tension in her shoulders. The way her hands trembled slightly as she accepted the business card. "Of course, Ms. Chen." Though I should mention that we're dealing with some false accusations from Emma's tutor. The poor man seems to have misunderstood Emma's creative storytelling for reality. Sarah nodded non-committally. She'd heard similar deflections countless times. The concerned parent narrative, designed to shift blame onto the reporter. I'll need to speak with Emma privately, as well as anyone else who witnessed the alleged incidents. Detective Morrison emerged from the kitchen, his expression grim. Ms. Chen. I'm Detective Morrison, BHPD. I've been documenting some concerning evidence in the kitchen area. Locked food storage, no accessible nutrition for a child Emma's age. Victoria's composure slipped another notch. Detective, surely you can see that those are safety measures. Emma has been getting into things she shouldn't. Like food? Sarah Chun's voice was sharp. Mrs. Blackwood, locking a child away from nutrition isn't a safety measure, it's abuse. In the library, James heard voices approaching and squeezed Emma's hand encouragingly. Remember, Emma, just tell the truth. These people are here to help you. Emma nodded, though she still looked terrified. She'd spent 6 months learning that adults couldn't be trusted, that speaking up only made things worse. The idea that these strangers might actually protect her seemed too good to be true. Sarah Chen entered the library and immediately focused on Emma. She'd seen enough. Malnourished children to recognize the signs, the hollow cheeks, the way Emma's clothes hung loose on her shrinking frame. The careful way she held herself as if any sudden movement might shatter her fragile existence. Hello, Emma, Sarah said gently, pulling up a chair to sit at the little girl's eye level. I'm Sarah, and I work with children to make sure they're safe and happy. Professor Wellington called me because he's worried about you. Can you tell me how you've been feeling lately? Emma glanced nervously at Victoria, who stood in the doorway with her arms crossed. Sarah noticed the dynamic immediately. Mrs. Blackwood, I'll need to speak with Emma privately. You can wait in the living room. I prefer to stay with my daughter, Victoria said smoothly. Emma can be ... imaginative sometimes. I'd hate for there to be any misunderstandings. That's exactly why I need to speak with her alone, Sarah replied firmly. Detective Morrison, would you please escort Mrs. Blackwood to the living room? Victoria's mask slipped entirely for a moment, revealing a flash of pure rage before she composed herself. Very well, but I want it noted that Emma has been having psychological difficulties since her father's death. She's been seeing a therapist, Dr. Harrison, who can vouch for her tendency toward fantasy. Sarah made a note to verify the therapist claim later. In her experience, abusers often invented medical professionals to support their narratives. Once Victoria left, Emma's entire posture changed. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, and she looked up at Sarah with desperate hope. Emma, Sarah said softly, I want you to know that you're safe right now. Nothing you tell me will get you in trouble. I'm here because people who care about you are worried. Can you tell me about the last few days? Emma's story came out in halting whispers. The missing chocolate, Victoria's accusation, the locked kitchen, 3 days without food, eating paper from her textbook. As she spoke, Sarah documented everything, noting the consistency of Emma's account and the physical evidence that supported it. Emma, can you show me the textbook you mentioned? With trembling hands, Emma opened her mathematics book to the pages she'd consumed. The torn edges, the bite marks along the paper, the missing sections, all painted a clear picture of desperation. Sarah photographed the evidence carefully, her heart breaking for this little girl who'd been reduced to eating schoolwork to survive. Emma, you were very brave to tell Professor Wellington what was happening, and you're being brave now by telling me. Will I get in trouble? Emma whispered. Victoria said if I told anyone lies about her, something bad would happen to my daddy's memory. Sarah felt anger burn in her chest. Threatening a child with desecrating her father's memory was psychological abuse of the cruelest kind. Emma, nothing bad will happen to your father's memory. And what you're telling me aren't lies, they're the truth. Sometimes adults do wrong things, and it's important for other adults to know so they can help. James Wellington spoke up from his position near the door. Ms. Chen, I have photos and video of the conditions I found Emma in. plus recordings of Mrs. Blackwood's threats to destroy evidence. I can provide all of that to support Emma's account." Sarah nodded gratefully. Having an educated, credible witness made this case significantly stronger. "Professor Wellington, would you be willing to provide a formal statement?" "Absolutely. I've been Emma's tutor for 6 months, so I can also document the changes in her physical and mental condition since Mrs. Blackwood took full control of the household." Through the library windows, Sarah could see another vehicle arriving, a van from the county's emergency child placement services. She'd called for backup support, anticipating that Emma might need immediate removal from the home. "Emma," Sarah said gently, "I'm going to need to talk to Victoria, Mrs. Blackwood, about what you've told me. While I do that, would you be comfortable staying here with Professor Wellington?" Emma nodded, clutching James's hand like a lifeline. Sarah found Victoria pacing in the living room, her phone pressed to her ear. She was speaking in rapid, angry whispers to someone, likely her sister Margaret, or perhaps a lawyer. "Mrs. Blackwood, I need to speak with you now." Victoria ended her call and turned with a bright, fake smile. "Of course, Ms. Chen. I hope Emma wasn't too difficult. As I mentioned, she's been having some challenges with reality since her father's death." Sarah consulted her notes. Emma provided a very detailed, consistent account of being denied food for 3 days as punishment for allegedly stealing chocolate. She showed me physical evidence of consuming pages from her textbook due to hunger. "Professor Wellington documented her condition and has video of you discussing destroying evidence. Can you explain these findings?" Victoria's smile faltered, then returned with increased intensity. "Ms. Chen, I think you're being manipulated by a troubled child and an overreaching tutor. Emma has full access to food, she simply chooses not to eat when she's having one of her episodes. As for the chocolate incident, it was a minor disciplinary matter that's been blown completely out of proportion. Show me Emma's access to food." Victoria led Sarah to the kitchen, where Detective Morrison was still documenting the locked cabinets and sealed pantry. Every single food item was behind barriers that only Victoria could open. "These are child safety measures," Victoria explained quickly. "Emma has gotten into things she shouldn't, eating chocolate until she's sick, making messes with flour and sugar. I had to secure the food for her own protection." Sarah opened one of the locked cabinets, revealing luxury items, imported caviar, truffle oil, aged cheeses. "Mrs. Blackwood, these are adult delicacies, not items that would harm a child, and you've locked away basic necessities, bread, milk, fruits, vegetables. How exactly was Emma supposed to eat?" "She knows to ask me for meals at appropriate times," Victoria replied, but her voice lacked conviction. "And during the 3 days when she was supposedly being punished for stealing chocolate," Victoria's pause was telling. She could have asked. She chose to be stubborn. Detective Morrison looked up from his documentation. "Mrs. Blackwood, I need to ask you directly. Did you deny Emma access to food from Monday through today as punishment for allegedly taking chocolate?" Victoria's lawyer training kicked in. "I don't recall specifically denying her food. Emma has been eating less due to her emotional state. It was a careful non-denial that fooled no one." Sarah had heard similar semantic games from abusers who thought they could avoid consequences through technicalities. "Mrs. Blackwood, based on my investigation, I'm placing Emma in emergency protective custody. She'll be staying with a licensed foster family while we conduct a full assessment of her living situation." Victoria's composure finally cracked completely. "You can't take her. This is my house. I'm her legal guardian. That little brat is lying about everything." The mask was off now, revealing the cruelty that had been hidden beneath the polished exterior. Sarah had seen this transformation many times, the moment when an abuser realized their control was slipping and dropped all pretense. "Mrs. Blackwood, your reaction is being noted for the record. I'm also requiring you to undergo a psychological evaluation and parenting classes before any visitation rights can be considered. I'll sue you. I'll sue the county. That child is a liar and a thief, and I won't be accused of neglect by some social worker who doesn't know what she's talking about." Detective Morrison stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to calm down. Your statements are being recorded, and they're not helping your case." In the library, Emma heard Victoria's shouting and pressed closer to Professor Wellington. "She's so angry," Emma whispered. "What if she tries to hurt me?" James wrapped his arms around the little girl protectively. "She can't hurt you anymore, Emma. These people won't let her." Sarah returned to the library with a gentle smile for Emma. "Sweetheart, I have some news. You're going to stay with a very nice family for a while, just until we make sure everything is safe. Their names are David and Martha Chen, no relation to me, and they've taken care of lots of children who needed help." Emma's eyes widened with fear. "I have to leave, but this is my daddy's house. What about his pictures and his books?" Sarah's heart ached for this child who'd lost so much. "We'll make sure you can take some special things with you, photos of your daddy, your favorite books, anything that's important to you. The Chuns live in a beautiful house with a big garden, and they have a little girl about your age named Lucy who's excited to meet you. Will Professor Wellington still be my teacher?" James spoke up immediately. "If you want me to be, Emma, I'll continue your lessons wherever you are. I'm not going anywhere." Emma nodded slowly, processing this enormous change. After 6 months of fear and isolation, the idea of living with kind people seemed almost impossible to believe. The emergency placement team arrived, 2 cheerful women who specialized in helping children transition to foster care. They brought a small suitcase and helped Emma pack her most precious belongings: a photo of her father, her favorite stuffed animal, some clothes, and ironically, the damaged mathematics textbook that had saved her life. "Why do you want to keep that book?" one of the social workers asked gently. Emma hugged it to her chest. "Because Professor Wellington found me when I was eating it. It helped him know I needed help." As they prepared to leave, Victoria made one last desperate attempt to maintain control. She appeared in the foyer with tears streaming down her face. Whether genuine or performed, it was impossible to tell. "Emma, sweetheart, please don't go with these strangers. I know we've had some misunderstandings, but this is your home. Your father wanted you to be with family." Emma looked at Victoria, the woman who'd starved her, threatened her, and tried to destroy her sense of reality. Then she looked at Professor Wellington, Sarah Chen, and the kind social workers who'd spent the afternoon protecting her. "My daddy wanted me to be safe and happy," Emma said quietly. "He wouldn't want me to be hungry." It was a moment of profound clarity from a 7-year-old who'd been forced to grow up too fast. Victoria had no response to the simple truth. As Emma left the Blackwood mansion for the first time in months, she turned back to look at the library windows where she'd spent so many happy hours with her father. The house looked different now, less like a prison and more like a place where good memories lived alongside the bad ones. "Will I ever come back?" she asked Sarah. "That depends on many things, Emma. But wherever you end up living, it will be somewhere safe, where you never have to be hungry or scared again." The Chen family lived in a modest but warm house in Pasadena, a world away from the cold marble of the Blackwood mansion. When Emma arrived, she was greeted by Martha Chen, a pediatric nurse with gentle eyes and soft hands, and David Chen, an elementary school principal who understood traumatized children. Their daughter, Lucy, age 8, had been in foster care herself before the Chuns adopted her. She took Emma's hand and showed her around the house: the cozy bedroom they'd prepared, the kitchen where snacks were always available, the reading nook by the window where Emma could have quiet time. "Are you hungry?" Martha asked as they settled in the living room. "I made chicken soup and sandwiches for dinner, but if you'd prefer something else, ... Emma stared at the woman in wonder. When was the last time an adult had asked what she wanted to eat, instead of telling her she couldn't have food at all? "Soup sounds perfect," Emma whispered. As Martha heated the soup, Emma sat at the kitchen table, a simple wooden one that was nothing like the formal dining room where Victoria had delivered her punishments. Lucy chatted cheerfully about school and friends and the tree fort her dad was building in the backyard. For the first time in months, Emma felt like she could breathe. That night, as Martha tucked her into a bed with soft sheets and a nightlight, Emma asked the question that had been weighing on her heart. What if Victoria was right? What if I am a bad kid who tells lies? Martha sat on the edge of the bed and took Emma's small hands in hers. Emma, sweetheart, listen to me very carefully. You are not bad, you are not a liar. You are a brave little girl who survived something very difficult, and now you're safe. But what if? No what ifs, Martha said firmly but kindly. What Victoria did to you was wrong. Adults are supposed to take care of children, not hurt them. You did nothing to deserve being treated that way. Emma cried then, not the silent tears she'd learned to hide, but the loud, messy sobs of a child who was finally safe enough to grieve everything she'd lost. Martha held her until the tears subsided, and Lucy brought her favorite stuffed elephant to share. For the first time in 6 months, Emma fell asleep, feeling protected and loved. Meanwhile, back at the Blackwood mansion, Victoria sat alone in the library where Emma had nearly starved to death. The torn mathematics textbook still lay on the desk, evidence of her cruelty that she couldn't explain away. Her phone rang, her lawyer, finally returning her frantic calls. Victoria, I've reviewed the preliminary reports. This doesn't look good. The physical evidence, multiple witness accounts, the child's medical condition. It's going to be very difficult to defend. Victoria stared out the window at the perfectly manicured gardens that had cost more than most people made in a year. All of this luxury, all of this status, and she was about to lose it. Because she couldn't control one small child. What are my options? She asked. Honestly, cooperation. If you acknowledge the problems, agree to counseling, show genuine remorse, maybe we can negotiate supervised visitation eventually. But if you keep claiming Emma was lying and Professor Wellington was delusional, you'll lose any chance of maintaining parental rights. Victoria hung up without responding. She wasn't interested in supervised visitation or counseling or admitting fault. She was interested in winning, in proving that she was the victim of a vindictive child and an interfering tutor. She had no idea that her next actions would destroy any remaining credibility she might have had. 3 days later, Emma was settling into her new routine with the Chen family. She attended therapy sessions with Dr. Rebecca Torres, a specialist in childhood trauma, who helped her process the abuse she'd endured. She continued her tutoring sessions with Professor Wellington, who now came to the Chen house twice a week. Most importantly, she was eating regular meals and gaining back the weight she'd lost during those terrible months with Victoria. Emma seems to be adjusting well, Dr. Torres told Sarah Chen during their weekly check-in. She's still hypervigilant around food, hoarding snacks, eating very quickly, as if someone might take it away. But that's normal for a child who's experienced food insecurity. How long before she feels truly safe? Sarah asked. Months, possibly years. The psychological scars from this kind of abuse run deep. But she has excellent support now, and children are remarkably resilient when they're in loving environments. What none of them knew was that Victoria was planning something that would traumatize Emma all over again. Victoria had spent 3 sleepless nights researching legal precedents and crafting a new strategy. If she couldn't win through official channels, she'd take matters into her own hands. She hired a private investigator to locate where Emma was staying. She researched the Chen family's schedules, learning that Martha worked night shifts at the hospital twice a week and David coached soccer on Saturday mornings. Victoria's plan was simple but devastating. She would rescue Emma from what she'd claim was an illegal kidnapping, take her across state lines to her sister Margaret's house in Nevada, and fight the custody battle from there. It was kidnapping, pure and simple, but Victoria had convinced herself it was justified. In her mind, she was the victim of a conspiracy between an unstable tutor and overreaching social workers. Emma belonged to her, and she was going to get her back. On Thursday evening, Victoria parked her car across the street from the Chen house and waited. Martha's car was gone. She was working the night shift at Children's Hospital. David's car was in the driveway, but Victoria knew from her surveillance that he usually went to bed early on weeknights. At 10 p.m., the house went dark except for a single light in what the private investigator had identified as Emma's bedroom window. Victoria checked her purse, duct tape, zip ties, and a syringe filled with a mild sedative she'd obtained through illegal channels. She had no intention of hurting Emma physically, but she needed the child to be quiet and compliant during the drive to Nevada. She had no idea that David Chen was a former Marine who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, or that the Chen family's security system included motion sensors and cameras that would alert him the moment someone approached the house. Victoria crept across the lawn toward Emma's bedroom window, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She was about to commit a felony, but in her mind, she was simply reclaiming what belonged to her. Emma's bedroom window was slightly open to let in the cool night air. Victoria could see the little girl sleeping peacefully, her arm around Lucy's stuffed elephant. Her face relaxed in a way Victoria had never seen during their months together. Victoria began to pry the window open wider, planning to climb inside and grab Emma before anyone could stop her. She never heard David Chen approaching from behind until his hand clamped down on her shoulder. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from the window and put your hands where I can see them." Victoria spun around, her eyes wild with panic and rage. "You can't keep me from my daughter. She belongs with me." David's military training kicked in as he assessed the threat. This woman was armed with restraint devices and sedatives, had broken onto his property with clear intent to harm a child in his care. She wasn't just a distraught parent, she was a dangerous predator. "Emma is not your daughter, and you're trespassing on private property with intent to commit kidnapping," David said calmly while discreetly signaling the silent alarm that would bring police to the scene. "I need you to put down your purse and step away from the house." Victoria's composure completely shattered. "That little brat has been filling people's heads with lies about me. I never hurt her. I gave her everything. And this is how she repays me, by running away with strangers." Inside the house, Emma woke to the sound of familiar shouting. Victoria's voice, filled with the same rage that had terrified her for months. Emma's breath caught in her throat as all the safety she'd built up over the past few days crumbled. Lucy woke up too, and immediately understood that something was wrong. She'd been in foster care long enough to recognize the signs of a child in crisis. "Emma, it's okay," Lucy whispered, grabbing her new sister's hand. "My dad won't let anyone hurt us. He's really strong and really smart." Through the window, they could see David Chen restraining Victoria while she screamed threats and accusations. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as they approached the neighborhood. "She came for me," Emma whispered, trembling. "She came to take me back." Martha Chen burst through the bedroom door. Having raced home from the hospital the moment David's emergency call came through, she gathered both girls in her arms, shielding them from the view of the confrontation outside. "Nobody is taking you anywhere, Emma," Martha said firmly. "That woman will never hurt you again." Outside, Victoria was now in handcuffs, screaming at the police officers about conspiracies and kidnapping while they read her rights. The evidence in her purse, the restraints, the sedatives, the detailed surveillance notes about the Chen family's schedule painted a clear picture of premeditated child abduction. Detective Morrison arrived on the scene and shook his head at Victoria's condition. "Mrs. Blackwood, you've just escalated this from a child welfare case to multiple felonies: breaking and entering, attempted kidnapping, possession of controlled substances with intent to harm a child." Victoria's lawyer arrived 20 minutes later to find his client ranting about her rights as a parent and demanding that Emma be returned to her immediately. He took one look at the evidence and the police reports and quietly began preparing for plea negotiations. There would be no more legal battles over Emma's custody. Victoria had destroyed any remaining credibility and guaranteed that she'd never be alone with the child again. The next morning, Sarah Chen arrived at the house with Dr. Torres to help Emma process what had happened. They found her sitting in the reading nook, clutching Professor Wellington's latest assignment and the damaged mathematics textbook that had saved her life. "Emma," Dr. Torres said gently, "how are you feeling about last night?" Emma looked up with eyes that seemed older than her 7 years. "She really did want to hurt me, didn't she?" "It wasn't just about the chocolate." "No, sweetheart, it was never about the chocolate. Victoria has problems that have nothing to do with you. She makes bad choices, and last night she made a very bad choice that will have serious consequences." Will I ever have to see her again? Sarah Chen spoke up. Emma, Victoria is going to prison. She broke very serious laws, and the judge won't let her near you ever again. You're safe now, and you're going to stay safe. Emma nodded slowly, then asked the question that had been haunting her. What's going to happen to my daddy's house? All his pictures and books are still there. Martha Chen sat beside Emma and took her hand. We can go get your father's things whenever you're ready. All of his photos, his books, anything that's special to you. This house will be your home for as long as you want it to be, but your father's memory comes with you wherever you go. That afternoon, Emma, the Chuns, and Professor Wellington made a trip to the Blackwood mansion. The house felt different now, emptier and colder, without Victoria's presence, but also less threatening. Emma walked through the rooms where she'd suffered, collecting precious memories of her father. His favorite books, photo albums, the piano music he'd bought for her lessons. She also took some of her mother's jewelry that Victoria had hidden away. In the library, she paused at the desk where she'd eaten paper to survive. Professor Wellington found her there, standing quietly in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows. This was where you found me, Emma said softly. This was where you saved yourself, James replied. You were brave enough to tell the truth when it mattered most. Emma picked up the torn mathematics textbook one last time. Should I leave this here? That's up to you, Emma. It's part of your story now, the bad part and the good part. Emma thought for a moment, then tucked the book under her arm alongside her father's photo albums. I think I'll keep it. To remember that even when things are really bad, someone will come help if you're brave enough to ask. 6 months later, Emma was thriving with the Chen family. Her weight had returned to normal. She was excelling in school, and her nightmares had mostly faded. Professor Wellington continued as her tutor, and she'd started piano lessons again, playing the music her father had bought but she'd never had the chance to learn. Victoria was serving a 5-year sentence in state prison for attempted kidnapping, child abuse, and multiple related charges. She'd refused all plea bargains and maintained her innocence throughout the trial, which had only resulted in a harsher sentence. The Blackwood mansion had been sold, with the proceeds placed in a trust fund for Emma's education and future needs. She would never need to worry about money, but more importantly, she would never need to worry about being safe and loved. On a warm spring afternoon, Emma sat in the Chen family's garden reading a new mathematics textbook, this one unstained by tears or hunger. Professor Wellington watched her work through advanced problems that would challenge children twice her age. Emma, he said, during their break, do you ever think about what you want to be when you grow up? Emma looked up from her equations, her eyes bright with possibility. I think I want to help other kids who are hungry or scared. Maybe be a social worker like Ms. Chen, or a teacher like you, or a doctor like Dr. Torres. That's a wonderful dream, James said. You'd be amazing at helping other children because you understand what it's like to need help. Emma nodded seriously. Everyone needs someone to believe them when they tell the truth, even when it's hard to believe. As the afternoon sun slanted through the garden, Emma returned to her mathematics. Real problems this time, not pages consumed out of desperation. She solved each equation with the same careful determination that had carried her through the darkest period of her young life. Behind her, the Chen family's house buzzed with the sounds of a happy home. Martha humming in the kitchen, David building a new bookshelf for Emma's growing collection, Lucy practicing violin in the living room. For the first time since her father's death, Emma felt like she belonged somewhere. Not because someone claimed to own her, but because she was genuinely loved and valued for who she was. The torn mathematics textbook sat on her bedroom shelf, no longer a symbol of desperation, but a reminder of resilience. Emma had learned that even in the darkest moments, hope could survive on the smallest things: a kind word from a teacher, a cookie shared in friendship, the courage to speak truth when silence felt safer. Victoria's attempts to break Emma's spirit had ultimately revealed the child's incredible strength, and Professor Wellington's decision to believe a little girl eating paper had saved more than just Emma's life. It had saved her faith in the goodness of adults, and her belief that justice was possible. The wicked had been punished, the good had been rewarded, and a little girl who once counted calories like a prisoner now counted her blessings like the beloved child she had always deserved to be. As Emma solved her final equation of the day, she smiled at the neat rows of numbers that made sense, unlike the chaos Victoria had tried to create in her life. Mathematics was logical, predictable. Fair qualities Emma had learned to treasure after months of living with someone who operated by no rules except cruelty. She closed her textbook gently, treating it with the respect she'd never been able to show the pages she'd consumed out of desperation. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, new growth, new reasons to believe that her father's love lived on in every adult who chose to protect rather than harm. Emma was no longer the hungry, frightened child who ate paper to survive. She was a survivor, a truth teller, and most importantly, a little girl who was finally, truly home. What part of Emma's journey touched your heart the most? Was it when Professor Wellington first found her eating paper? Or when she found the courage to tell the truth to Detective Morrison? Have you ever witnessed someone stepping up to protect a vulnerable child? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story of kindness might inspire others to be brave when someone needs help. We hope this story reminded you that even in the darkest moments, there are people willing to stand up for what's right. If you know a child who needs an adult to believe them, be that person. And if this story gave you hope during a difficult day, please share it with someone who might need to hear Emma's message of survival and healing. Thank you for listening with your whole heart. Rest well tonight, knowing that goodness exists in this world. And tomorrow brings new opportunities to choose compassion over cruelty.